Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Forum, to those of you in the Great Hall and also at home joining us by Zoom. This morning, we welcome back Rabbi Scott Meltzer. I will introduce him, and then the rabbi will read the opening prayer, give the opening prayer, and then his presentation. Rabbi Scott Meltzer serves as rabbi of Or Shalom Synagogue in the historic synagogue building located at 3rd and Laurel in San Diego. He is a lecturer in religious studies at San Diego State University. Rabbi Meltzer serves on the board of directors for the ADL of San Diego and Hillel of San Diego. He is a former chaplain with the San Diego Police Department and a past president of the San Diego Rabbinical Association. Previously, Rabbi Meltzer served as the founding dean of students in residential life at the American Hebrew Academy in Greensboro, North Carolina. Prior to that, he was director of education of the Brandeis Bardin Institute, where he was responsible for programs in residential and experiential Jewish education. Before BBI, Rabbi Meltzer worked at the University of Southern California, assisting in courses in the Hebrew Bible, ancient Near Eastern mythology, Western literature, and ethics. He has also served congregations in Los Angeles and Santa Maria, California, and Butte, Montana, as well as a hospital chaplaincy in New York. Rabbi Meltzer graduated and was ordained through the Hebrew Union College. As a rabbinic student, he was selected as a Wexner Graduate Fellow, a program designed to identify individuals interested in pursuing graduate work and professional training in Jewish communal life, who exhibit exceptional leadership potential. Born in Akron, Ohio, Rabbi Meltzer was raised there and in San Diego. He was part of the graduating class at the San Diego Jewish Academy. After graduating Patrick Henry High School, he earned a BA with honors in chemistry from Harvard before attending rabbinic school. Rabbi Meltzer also holds a master's degree in religion and social ethics from the University of Southern California and was recently honored with an honorary doctorate of divinity from Hebrew Union College and was named most influential faculty member in modern Jewish studies at San Diego State University. Rabbi Meltzer came to Or Shalom in August 2003. He lives in San Diego with his wife Jennifer, their daughters Shana, son Nadiv, daughter Maytal, daughter Yael, and their dog Tikkun. Jennifer Meltzer is an alumna of HUC and USC and has master's degrees in Jewish communal services and social work, and currently works at the Neiman Preschool of the Lawrence Family Jewish Community Center in La Jolla. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Rabbi Scott Meltzer.
It looks like the masking rules have changed since I was last here. I was just commenting that the worst part of all of it I've discovered is a sweaty upper lip. I was asked to deliver the opening prayer, which is an odd request. It was a sincere and respectful one, but I find that we represent very different traditions of prayer. And in fact, that would be an interesting future study and maybe dialogue about prayer. So most of the praying that I do, most of the praying that Jews do, and most of the praying that Jews have done for the last 13, 14, or 15 centuries is what a sociologist would call closed scripted. That is, I read from a book as opposed to spontaneous prayer or open scripted prayer. So the prayer that I'm about to share comes from the Babylonian Talmud. It's given in the name of Rabbi Nehunia ben Hakana, and there's a neat little discussion there in the Babylonian Talmud on the 28th page on the verso, on the back side of the page, about a short little prayer that he uttered when he would enter into the house of study, and I find it lovely as a mindfulness. So I offer it as my prayer, but I help offer it for all of us. Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, Bichnisato, Mahu Omer, Yiratzon your will, Lord my God, that nothing bad should occur because of me, that I should not stumble in any matter of the tradition or teaching, and that my colleagues should all rejoice and be happy with me, in me. But also say, and also that I will not say that that which is pure is impure, or that which is impure is pure, and that my colleagues also, or my friends also, should not stumble or err in a matter of teaching or judgment. And please God, may they be pleased with me. Amen. How many of you were here when I was here last time? Which doesn't seem like that long ago. All right. So, oh, there you go, see? When I was here last time, whenever that was, I was invited and we spoke about teaching related to the movements in Judaism, or contemporary movements in Judaism. And I opened by saying that's my topic and I'm not going to talk about it because it doesn't make any sense without understanding how we get to the 19th and 20th century. So hopefully for those of you who are here, that will serve as the introduction and the background. And for the rest, you're missing chapter 1, I don't know, ask me about it later. I hope to speak for about 30 to 40-ish and then to take questions, but feel free if you have a question relevant to what I'm doing, or if something I say is unclear, or as I am prone to do, if I either speak too quickly or use jargon, be it Jewish, religious, or borrowed from a foreign language. And so for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to do my best to talk about modern Jewish movements. And the first thing is, it's really important, I think, to talk about movements rather than denominations. Denominations is a different way to frame differences within a tradition. And in fact, in the context of Christianity, I was fascinated as a child because there are Jews in this world, and Jews come in a variety of flavors. Jews look differently, Jews live differently, Jews, but they're Jews. And in my, raised in a Jewish world perspective, I thought the same thing about Christians. And then I think the first time I ever really noticed it was, it took me a while to figure it out in middle school Spanish, that in Spanish, Cristianos and Católicos, they're not just different denominations, they're different religions in Latin American culture. I mean, they really are different. Again, I don't know that they really are different religions, but they're viewed as different religions in the context. And I had some very, very good friends who were Mormon who talked about not being accepted as Christians, which I thought was fascinating because, again, a Jewish kid, the world's simple to me. There's Jews and there's non-Jews, and amongst non-Jews there's a whole bunch of people who are Christians. Some pray on this corner, some pray on the next corner. Their sacred objects look a little different. Maybe their language of prayer is different. But just like all Jews are Jews, right? So it's not as true, or it's true differently in a non-Jewish context. So we talk about movements, and movements are a modern phenomenon in Judaism. There have been sects, there have been splinter groups, there have been regional differences, there have been communities that have disagreed. Disagreement is part and parcel of Judaism, seeing the world as different in Judaism. The easiest example of this, for me, is to look at the vastly diverse theologies that are present in the Hebrew Bible. Vastly, vastly different. Right now in our annual cycle, we are reading the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy has a theology that says God will reward the collective people if they are righteous and faithful to God, and the rain will come in its season, the crops will go, they will know peace and long life. Not the individual, that's a different theology, but as a group, right? Any given individual might suffer, but collectively the group will prosper based on the book of theology. And then on the far other side, perhaps, is the book of Ecclesiastes that says God doesn't pay any attention to you, God will not reward you, God doesn't think about you, get over it, or get over yourselves. So, they're both sacred books in my Bible. They're sacred books in my Bible, but they certainly don't agree on what the universe looks like, what God is like, or therefore how one would worship or be in relationship to God. So to me, that's Jewish. I got cousins, I got neighbors, I got all sorts of people who believe and think and all kinds of different things, but they're all part of the same community, and that's always been true. And then, as I tried to show last time, modernity changed it because the Jewish community is no longer a person's primary identifier. people relate to non-Jewish institutions before Jewish institutions, but that's last time. So movements are a creation of the mid to late 19th century, beginning in Germany, finding really fertile soil in the freedoms and in some ways the anti-Semitism of the United States. So what I want to do is look a little bit at the historical development, but then what these movements really are, and I'm going to focus on the three major movements. I would say there are at least three others that are significant and worth mentioning, and maybe I'll mention them, but time is limited. But it's really, really hard. It's really, really hard to talk about them because it depends on which eyeglasses I put on. Because I can give you my own opinion about what I think about different movements. I was raised and ordained in one, and I serve as a rabbi in another one, and I lived part of my life in Israel in the third one, so I have my own biases. I can speak in the language of sociology. I can speak, if you put three rabbis here for the three movements I'm going to discuss, they would sound very, very different than if you took like the president of the congregation, or if you took a 15-year-old who grew up in the congregation, or some such. So how you look at it has a lot to do with what it is. So I'm going to try and look at it at least in two or three different ways. One is from a kind of a 35,000-foot perspective. I want to know intellectually or philosophically or theologically, what are the underpinnings of these movements? So, if I were writing a textbook, as I teach my class at State, this is like what the movements stand for. But then I want to look a little bit in terms of the lived experience or kind of the sociology and how they live and function in a different sort of way. And some of that will be modern political America because that's America we live in. The three movements I want to look at in the United States in the 20th and 21st century are Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. And I put them in that order. One, because that's their relative size in the United States. And two, historically, that's the order in which they really identify as movements. I didn't put a table here. The Reform movement represents about over 30%, maybe 35% of people who identify themselves as Jewish in America. Most of my data comes from the most recent Pew research from 2021. 30 some odd percent. Probably used to be much higher, probably about 17% identify as conservative. About 9% identify as Orthodox, some flavor or another of Orthodox. A very large group, 27%, who identify as Jewish, don't identify under any of these monikers. They wouldn't call them, they're a Jew, but they wouldn't call themselves a Reformer, Conservative, or Orthodox, or some kind of Orthodox Jew. And then about 4% make up these other three movements in Judaism that I may mention at the end. So they're interesting, they're important, but they're not such a large number. Go back early on in the 19th century, as Jews become good German citizens, the religion changes. Lo and behold, when you don't make people live in a ghetto, or you let them go to regular schools, or you let them do business with the predominantly Lutherans, with the Christians of Germany, then they start to look and act more like that, more like 19th century gentlemen. A whole lot of concern about men in the 19th century, but I think there were women there too. Comes into this country, has its own history. Earliest one that we can find is 1824 in South Carolina, an organization of a group called the Reformed Society of Israelites. Language really matters. It's more accessible to us in English. Well into the 20th century, Jew in many contexts is a pejorative term. So a whole lot of the old institutions, with a couple of notable exceptions, don't put the word Jew or Jewish in their name. And in fact, the large national, now international organization of the Reform congregations, of the Reformed Jewish congregations, organized in 1873 in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is historically significant, but time is limited, called itself the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. They saw themselves as Hebrews of a Mosaic persuasion. I can show you that in an 1880-something document from Pittsburgh. Because Jew, predominantly in English, was seen as a pejorative term. It's fascinating. That organization, founded in 1873, about a decade ago, went from being the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the UAHC, to the Union of Reformed Judaism, the URJ. The word reform has taken on increased importance, and Jewish, in most circles, is not seen as a pejorative, but both a correct term and a term to be proud. When Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise organizes first a rabbinic seminary in Cincinnati and the Union, his vision is for an American Judaism. That's why it's the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And he imagined that everybody would come. Everybody, all the Jews would come, because there wasn't anything like that, no superstructure of synagogues and no seminary. And he thought that he could create one, and the more traditional oriented would stay traditional, and those who were more active in the reform mindset, in terms of an evolving Judaism, a modern Judaism, a more scientific Judaism, that they would be able to study together, because history is history, the sacred texts are sacred texts, and then one could go out and live somewhere in that diversity. But when he opened his school in 1875, nobody came except for the liberal reformers. And he was really disappointed. He really thought that because all Jews are Jews, and, we all agree on what happened up until today, the sacred books, the old sacred books are all the old sacred books. It would make perfect sense that we could be in union together, and it would make perfect sense that our students could study together, and then some would go into more. Isaac Mayer Wise publishes a prayer book, an American prayer book, the first one in the 1850s. And he has some reformist ideas. Now that we are citizens of a democracy rather than subjects as a community of a monarch, he writes out most of Israel. Jews traditionally multiple times a day have prayed in different prayers for the ingathering of the exiles, that God will return all Jews from the four corners of the earth. Well, first good Germans and then good Americans in the 19th century didn't pray for the day when God would save me from America and take me back to David's kingdom and God's holy temple. And so Isaac Mayer Wise said, if we don't believe that, we should get rid of that. I don't want people to hear me praying for that. The whole Messiah thing, good 19th century intellectual revolution, that whole Messiah thing, that whole resurrection thing. Jews traditionally believe in the resurrection of all peoples when the Messiah comes. Doesn't hold up so well in 19th century science. Isaac Mayer Wise wants to get rid of that. The acknowledgement that very few people speak Hebrew, so that the service should be more reflective of English. Those are kind of the big issues. Even the observance of the Sabbath itself, because now that Jews are doing business in South Carolina with all the rest of the import-export and all the rest, then you can't be closed on Saturdays. You can't be closed on Saturdays because that's an important day of business. So a lot more flexibility around the traditions. Those are the basis of reform organized in the 1870s. In fact, my building, a couple blocks that way at 3rd and Laurel, is the second building of the first Reformed Jewish congregation in San Diego. They date back to the 1880s. Their original building used to be down on B and Market, maybe? No, not B and Market, they don't cross. B in front, I don't know, somewhere about a mile south of us was their original building that back in the they built in the 1880s. In the 1980s, the city bought it and they moved it over to Old Town. It's now called Heritage Park. You can visit the original building that they built not too long after Isaac Mayer Wise does all this in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then it's kind of fun, in the 1920s, the Jewish community had moved way out to the suburbs and way uptown, that they had to build a building from, we'll call it Front and B, they had to build a building up at 3rd and Laurel, right? Because it wasn't like today when everybody's moving off to the suburbs, so people want to build a campus in Carmel Valley or somewhere else there. It was only about a mile from the old building to the new building. Anyway, so that's the beginning of and the basis of reform. And reform develops around an idea that an important late 20th century thinker, Leonard Fine, wrote a wonderful book, 1980 something, called Reform as a Verb. So rather than there being a reformation or it being formed Judaism, reform is an ongoing and constant piece. So when we look at the things that appeared radical in 1880s, it wasn't as if the societies stopped evolving and all was set in stone and all was good from there. So the Reform movement has continued, at least as a large group, to be the leading, fastest-paced, evolving Jewish community. We'll see that a little later when we talk about things like the ordination of women or the inclusion of LGBTQ or a whole variety of issues. Much more open to change. And along those lines, the Reform movement fully embraces the idea that any previous expression of Judaism, and they wouldn't have framed it this way, important document from Columbus in 1880-something, in Pittsburgh in 1930, there are platforms of the movement, even the platform from 1970, which is an important document. But I would say today, the Reform movement fully understands that all moments in history are contextualized within a social movement or within a moment, within a milieu. And so the need to constantly update, it's not just, your security patches on your windows that need to keep coming out with new things, but the world really is different. And we're all old enough to remember how different the world was in our childhood, right? It was radically different. Those of us in San Diego, it's a different city. My children are raised in a different world, and it cracks me up when they point out to me when I sound like a dinosaur. Because they're usually right. I mean, when they want to complain because they don't like something, they tell me they don't like it. But when they think their dad is just antiquated, then they call me a dinosaur. And they're right, and I look at it. So the Reform movement, when we talk about things, depending on who you were to ask about the core issue in Judaism, when we get to orthodoxy, the classic medieval belief is that the core responsibility for the Jewish people is to follow the rules that God gave as written in the 5 books of Moses, classically framed as 613 commandments, 248 thou shalts, 365 thou shalt nots. And at the core of orthodox, I'm now jumping ahead, is the idea that that thing called halakha, Jewish way, something like that, is binding, will forever be binding. The Reform movement, it's taken a century to figure it out, is very comfortable saying that was true for a period of time. But it's not true today. It's not true today. So how do we understand Judaism? How do we understand, it's not just God's relationship to the Jewish people, it's how do we understand God, God's self? And so the Reform movement is the most open to radical recreations of Judaism, and it is an ongoing piece. And one of the challenges that it has faced is how to maintain continuity when, conscious evolution is part of your identity. And, and as you move forward and make changes, how do you know that it's still authentic and not just either trendy or not making you something other than Jewish? And so there's some wonderful thinkers, a lot of work that goes in there. There are new movements, the Jewish dietary laws, what I can eat and what I can't eat. We say kosher, the better noun is kashrut, is the category. A number of years ago, an important Reform teacher, environmental activist, declared styrofoam. Nobody uses styrofoam anymore, so it's, maybe it's just because he was so successful. Declared styrofoam not kosher, as if styrofoam was a pork chop or a slice of bacon or a piece of shrimp, right? So taking the tradition from those who are supporters of the movement, that's exactly taking the values and virtues and symbolism of the tradition, the language of the tradition, kashrut being about things that are acceptable and things that aren't acceptable, and caring about the earth is a long time old Jewish value going back to the Bible, and saying kashrut, it's been extended. There's stuff about whether or not an animal that's shechted, slaughtered in the proper way and prepared in the proper way and all sorts of things, from a slaughterhouse that doesn't pay living wages, whether or not that should be considered kosher. And so there's a movement that it's not just what the ancient, late antiquity, and medieval world decided was required to make something kosher or not kosher, but there's a whole other set of issues as well. Right? Cool stuff. Lots of neat stuff coming out of the Reform movement. Over the last, really beginning in the 50s, so not so recent, the Reform movement has been very politically active in the United States. Through one of its institutions called the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. In fact, in their original building, some of the old 50s legislation that was ultimately introduced and enacted as part of the Civil Rights Movement in Congress in the 50s was written in the Kivy-Kaplan Law Center, whatever it's called, in D.C. So a very long history of social activism, of working both on the streets and in the halls for social change, for civil rights, and so forth. This is off the Reform Movement's website, urj.org. The Reformed Jewish Movement believes there is more than one authentic way to be Jewish, and that Judaism must change and adapt to the needs of the day to survive. The Union for Reformed Judaism's legacy, reach, leadership, and vision ensure that we can unite thousands of years of tradition with modern experience to strengthen Judaism today and for generations to come. That's the Reform Movement. Again, if people ask, I can offer my own critique and whatever else. On some level, a generation ago, well, when Reform started, some people trace the history of Reform to Immanuel Kant and a group of German Jewish intellectuals, philosophers, having to do with issues of autonomy. The belief that each individual is their own autonomous self and can make their own decisions. It's not the motivating raison d'etre of the Reform movement today, but probably because pretty much everybody agrees to it, right? Everybody agrees that at the end of the day, each individual decides what is right or wrong, which is condemned horrifically in the book of Judges as being a terrible, terrible system. But even when we see in the Orthodox world, in the American context, free will and individual autonomy bring somebody into an Orthodox setting, right? And they can choose to accept that God has commanded them to do X, Y, and Z and so forth. But it's all predicated on this thing that the Reform movement really brought beginning in the 19th century in Germany. The idea that each individual, which in Judaism I think may be more radical than Christianity, and it's certainly different in an Episcopalian cathedral than it is in other parts of the Christian world. And I think, in this way you and I have more in common, that at the core of Judaism is the communal experience. The covenant is made with a community, it's not made with one person. The purpose of Judaism is not for one individual to meet and interface and somehow interact with God, but it's to live within the sacred community and what that means. So this idea of each individual as being an autonomous self is really a big deal. And I think, a century and a half later, that's where we are. I think everybody operates that way. Conservative Judaism is a neat story. So I was raised at a Reform synagogue over near San Diego State, and I went to exactly that Reform seminary, HUC, the Hebrew Union College. Though the original campus was in New York. The original campus was in Cincinnati, Ohio. Back in the 1950s, I think it combined with another Reform seminary that had opened later called the Jewish Institute of Religion. Now it's officially called Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, because long names matter. And the campuses, they're in the process of closing down the original campus in Cincinnati, but they have vibrant campuses in LA, in New York, and in Jerusalem. But the synagogue I serve is a conservative synagogue. It is affiliated with what used to be called the United Synagogue of America and is now called the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Also from late in the 19th century, the conservative movement has a different history. The conservative movement, again, Orthodox, Jews were not Orthodox in the Middle Ages. I have Orthodox colleagues who tell me that, and they're wrong. They are just, historically, it's anachronistic. Jews were Jews in the 19th century, in the Middle Ages, up until emancipation, but they didn't belong to a movement of any kind. There were sects, there were regional differences, people followed their individual rabbis, but there were not movements, not Orthodox and not Reform and not conservative. when a group of Jews who don't like what the reformers are doing, who don't like writing Israel and resurrection and Messiah, getting rid of so much of Hebrew, they don't like getting rid of Saturday as a not work day. But at the same time, they're living in America, predominantly in New York. The conservative movement really is. There are all sorts of ways in which the reform movement is a product of the Midwest and the South, at least from the late 19th into the first part of the 20th century. Conservative Judaism was a New York phenomenon in its birth. And they were a group who, as opposed to the Jews who had been in America already for 100 years and were really, really American, and so it didn't make these things were so troubling to them. Conservative movement was predominantly German Jews who had been here for a generation or two, not the mad crush of the first part of the 20th century and Eastern European Jews yet, but they wanted to live a very traditional life. They were functionally what we might call Orthodox today, but they were intellectually in a different place. They wanted to be modern kind of inside of their head. And so they understood, like, the problems with believing that God handed the whole Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. Okay? They intellectually couldn't be medieval, but their norms and practices, they saw no reason to make major changes. So whereas the early reformers rewrote the prayer book because those things were wrong, the early conservative Jews say that's how Jews pray, but that's not how Jews believe. And it's easy to defend that because the book of Ecclesiastes is in the Bible, the book of Esther is in the Bible, because God as imagined in Deuteronomy is not God as imagined in Leviticus, is not God as imagined in Exodus. Judaism has always had incredibly vast free range intellectually. So they were much more nerdy, bookish, and their institution, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which they founded on the Upper West Side of New York, right by Columbia, or way up, whatever that is in the 120s. Their institution was an institution of serious scholarship. Before universities started having departments of Jewish studies, the Jewish Theological Seminary was unequivocally the finest academic Jewish study institution either in the world or on par with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, depending on where you put that in the 20th century. And some of the greatest scholars of the 20th century who really created the field, until a few of them left, like Wolfson left and went to Harvard, and then Harvard got its Near Eastern Languages department, and now the whole world is different. But it was intellectually this incredibly gifted movement of intellectual honesty that wasn't concerned that they were saying a 1700-year-old prayer about the bodily resurrection of all peoples. They didn't believe that, right? You couldn't be a scientifically oriented person in the first part of the 20th century and believe that. Our world now is so crazy, that's a whole other talk. And so they created what will become conservative Judaism. It's not its name in the very, very beginning, which in some ways looks orthodox, but is intellectually independent and even rigorous and outstanding. And over time, and this was true in the 1880s, and it's equally true in the 2020s, the conservative movement follows the reform movement whenever the reform movement gets it right. It just takes about 10 to 30 years longer, depending on where it is. Because the conservative movement is too intellectually oriented and honest to be able to forever maintain that women can't serve as rabbis, as an example, right? You could intellectually make an argument, certainly before World War II. World War II changes the nature of feminism and the inclusion of women in the United States. For a solid 50 years of conservative movement, there wasn't an intellectual disconnect because women weren't in leadership roles elsewhere. So the reform movement earlier saw the injustice of gender inequality and said that's wrong. Still takes till 1974 to get a female reform rabbi. It's not as if they were, amongst the suffragettes getting the 19th Amendment passed. I mean, it may have been. But the conservative movement takes much longer, but at some point, you can't defend the segregation of women anymore. So the conservative movement gets there through its intellectual honesty, but the Reform movement has already been there through its sense that change is a good. Right? I would say that reform or religious evolution for the Reform movement is a good, and in the conservative movement it's inevitable. And the challenge is, how does one stay connected to the tradition, that's why it's called conservative, while allowing for this change. And therefore it's much slower to make changes. It is. And when sometimes kooky things happen out there in the world, and the conservative movement hasn't moved in that direction, then the conservative movement says, see, we were right. But it takes an extra 12 years, I think. I've got a slide with the actual dates, to get a woman rabbi. Or LGBTQ+. The conservative movement as a movement is slower than the Reform movement. So what does that mean? It means that in many ways conservative Judaism looks much more traditional. Conservative Judaism still lives in a rubric intellectually where Jewish law is still binding on the Jewish people, which cracks me up because the vast majority of my congregants would laugh hysterically at that comment. But the movement believes that the construct of Jewish law still pertains to the Jewish people, even though they understand that it came into somewhere around really the 6th or 7th century. It became kind of universal, or the rubric under which Judaism lived solidly for 1,000 years. But it's still relevant, right? It's been desacralized, or it's been disconnected from being a direct expression of God's will. So it's easier to make changes, but it still is valid, and you need to make changes when something's wrong. Whereas the Reform movement says, well, that's just not part of it anymore. Right? I just had a conversation yesterday about why the Jewish laws related to wine are racist. So the Jewish laws related to wine are racist. So the Reform movement says, so they don't apply anymore. Like, don't be surprised that the medieval world was racist. It was sexist. It was. So we don't do that anymore. So we take those racist laws and we get rid of them. Right? And the conservative movement says, no, but the laws are still valid, so we have to change them and adapt them, not get rid of the structure, but make it, more in line both with our values, but also with what we believe God intended in this world. That's a whole great piece, goes back to my Maimonides, I'll let it go. So my services are much longer than the services of my childhood. My service is the conservative synagogue 3 blocks away, has much more Hebrew. My prayer book, and they just came out with a new prayer book that's a little bit more radical. It's still not as radical as the Reform movement's 1974 or 1978 new revised Gates of Prayer. But they've done some radical things, like there's prayers where they have alternatives. You could do the A page or the B page, which in a Jewish traditional prayer book is radical. They've written out a couple of problematic concepts in a couple of specific spots. They've added Miriam. They've added Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah into what had only had boys' names into it for 2,000 years, 14 centuries. And so, those are things that were old school when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s in the Reform movement. So here's a case where it took like 40 to 50 years, but the change is there. And the change is there in a very conservative movement way. The Reform movement is much more comfortable saying, that's wrong, get rid of it, and let's write something new. And the conservative movement is much more comfortable saying, that was historical, right? It had its moment. It's now out of place. We need to update it and change it. But our update and change it is not just willy-nilly, or not just based on what we want. What can we find in the tradition to ground it? So there's a prayer traditionally done in the name of Abraham, said 3 times a day. The Reform movement added Sarah to it, to recognize that Abe didn't live his life alone. In fact, they were married a really, really long time. And so they added Abraham and Sarah. But the thing about Abraham is actually linked to a story and a virtue of Abraham in the Bible. So you just throw Sarah onto that, and it's like, like a knee-jerk, hiccup kind of thing. So when the conservative movement, a couple decades later, did the exact same thing, they found a biblical precedent about Sarah, so that the prayer praises in the name of Abraham, who God was the Magain, God protected Abraham from a specific story, and also the God who remembered, Poked Sarah, So it wasn't just done because let's make it gender equal or to bring Sarah in or to remember our matriarchs, right? That's the motivator for it. But it was done in a way that is much more tied to the tradition, right? Again, my own sense, pluses and minuses. Conservative Judaism is rooted in the wisdom gained at the intersection of heritage and progress. This balance allows Jews to lead truly fulfilled lives and in an ever-evolving world provides a message of compassion, enlightenment, and holiness to communities everywhere. So it's this balance, this intersection of heritage and progress. And the balance of to do it, for the chemists, it's a rate of change challenge. How much dissonance or challenge needs to be in the system to cause change to happen, and it's a much higher barrier in the conservative movement. Orthodoxy organizes about 10 years later. So when Isaac Mayer Weiss starts the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, he thought that all synagogues would join. They don't. Then what we know of as the conservative movement founds the United Synagogues of America. Again, thinking it was for everybody, or everybody except for the kooky reformers, predominantly in the South and Midwest. But everybody in New York, everybody in New York was going to be included in that. And it lasted for about 10 years. And it was a really great interplay when we look back on it now, and if we think that that's the conservative movement and the founding of the Orthodox movement, there's a great deal of respect. They weren't playing around with throwing out the prayer book or men and women sitting together, God forbid, or such radical change. But over time, there becomes an element that's uncomfortable with the intellectual heresy of modernity, with even some of the beginnings of change at JTS and at the United Synagogue of America, and they find their own, and they call themselves Orthodox. And that's an important term, because generally speaking, there's not a lot of docs in Judaism. All right, dox is about ideas, about thoughts. So Orthodox is about, controlling ideas or all agreeing. Judaism is all over the map intellectually. The Bible is, and every generation of Jewish literature is. And a group decides that this conservative group in New York is plenty conservative in terms of their synagogues, but their ideas are too radical, right? We now have what then was called higher biblical criticism. Today then we started calling it the documentary hypothesis. Today we just refer to it as biblical criticism, that God didn't really write the Bible and hand it to Moses on Mount Sinai. And so that becomes one of the things that if you can accept that God didn't write the Bible, then you're already too modern for a certain group of people. So they rally their wagons around this idea of orthodox. They won't allow kind of too modernist thinking to come into their head. Now, they were far more open than orthodoxy is today. Right? They were, when they find Yeshiva University in 1896, 10 years after JTS, there are classes that are taught even up to the 60s and 70s at Yeshiva University in New York that you would get thrown out of the school. If today you took that class, like at Jewish Theological Seminary or online somewhere, you would be asked to leave from the rabbinical program, not the undergraduate college, but the rabbinical program at Yeshiva University, if you were in a class that studied ideas that were too modern. I don't mean chemistry and physics and math. I mean on Jewish or religious subjects. So there's been a retrenchment in that kind of orthodoxy over time, which is fascinating. 1896, the founding of a group of synagogues that say, yeah, the United Synagogue of America is not kosher enough for us. They're a little bit too, modern or a little bit too American. Orthodoxy never congeals in the same way the Reform and Conservative does. There are far more kind of smallish Orthodox groups that bond together. And like everybody else, they're struggling with rate of change and how much we fight against contemporary culture and contemporary ideas, and how much we embrace them, but we dip them in a mikveh. Mikveh is the traditional Jewish pool to remove impurities. So how much is it that we take other ideas and then we Judaize them, we make them Jewish, or how much do we just reject them? All right. So reform is constantly reforming. It's connected to the past, but not bound to it. Conservative, the past is still binding, but more open to change, but slower to change, and that change needs to be understood and incorporated into Jewish ideas and Jewish symbols. Even if the idea starts from a totally other place, that when it comes into the tradition, it's not just like racism is wrong, now Judaism is not racist. Okay, so racism is wrong, and Judaism can't be racist anymore. And how can we find in the tradition to defend that statement rather than just the societal, common awareness that racism is wrong, or the internal moral repugnance that racism raises for each of us? So how can we really make racism a Jewish value and show that the kernels of it or whatnot have always been there? And then orthodoxy is that God's covenant with the Jewish people is unchanging, that the predominant experience of that covenant are the 365 don'ts and the 248 do's as present in the Torah. And it's not just in the Torah, because if you were to read the 5 books of Moses, you couldn't find those 613 and you could not understand them. So there is now a 2,500-year history of how Jews have read those books the right way, right? So that's how I know that I need to have 2 sets of dishes in my house. One for meat and one for dairy products. And I have 2 sets of flatware and 2 sets of pots and pans. And I have specific how I clean them and all the rest. And you can't find that in a single verse of the Torah. Okay? That's all human additions. Watch this. One of my favorite jokes. You gotta watch my time, I'll be quick. Moses is on top of the mountain, and God says to Moses, Al tevashel gedi b'chalav imo. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, that's the way that the non-Jews do sacrifice. They take the baby and the mother, and I won't do that. Jews can't do that. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, just to be careful, I'm not going to eat the 2 of them together, milk and meat. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, to be really careful, I'm never going to eat meat and never eat milk together. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, you know what? I'm not even going to eat milk with chicken, even though he doesn't lactate, there's no issue there, but no, better safe than sorry. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, but fish is different. I'm okay with cheese and fish, it won't be a problem. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I better have 2 sets of dishes, one to do when I have a meat kind of thing and one to do when I have a dairy kind of thing. And God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I'm going to have 2 sets of flatware and 2 sets of pots and pans. And God says, you know what, do whatever you want. So to be simplistic, an Orthodox mind, an Orthodox rabbi, would tell you that my 2 sets of dishes is absolutely contained in the Torah. A conservative rabbi, that's mostly what I am, will tell you, yeah, this is how it happened. I can show you the historical development, how those laws developed, so much so that there's a movement today that Jews who use dishwashers should have 2 dishwashers, right? Which is an absurdity. Right? But there was a time where somebody said that 2 sets of dishes was an absurdity. That just happened to be in the 4th century. So, but that one caught hold. I'm not sure the 2 dishwasher thing's going to catch hold. There are people who do it. Yeah, no. And really, so that one I haven't seen. So the conservative rabbi will say, this is the historical development of the laws of kashrut. If you want to somehow believe that God's hand is manifest, that somebody believes that 2 dishwashers is the right answer, Zygazant the hate, let it be for your health, I don't care. But this is the historical development, but you should still keep kosher. Kashrut is still a Jewish virtue, and I believe that all Jews should struggle in the direction of kashrut, even if we don't all agree on the details. And a Reform rabbi would agree that this is the historical development. Right? There's no intellectual dishonesty. But it would be a choice. If you want to observe kosher, don't keep kosher. It's not binding on you as part of God's will or part of the covenant, or binding because it's part of the tradition. It is part of the tradition, so I encourage you to learn about it. Right? It might be a good choice for you and your family and your life, but it might not be. And there's nothing wrong with being a pork chop eating Jew in a Reform context. Okay? Fascinating stuff. Orthodoxy would say that acknowledging that things change, whoops, the wrong way. But things change slowly. In the United States, functionally, Reform Judaism is highly compelling for people who truly are progressive, who believe that the world is getting better and better and want to proactively help to stage that. The conservative movement has a certain Goldilocks flavor to it. I have a whole bunch of congregants who don't go to Orthodox synagogues because they want to sit with their husband or sit with their wife, or because they can't believe the nonsense that's still medieval about sexism or about other issues that are present. So they're not comfortable in an Orthodox, and they're totally fine driving their car on a Saturday. Like they want to have Friday night Shabbat dinner and observe the Sabbath, maybe even come to synagogue. But they have no problem getting in their car and driving to the beach or going to a movie or going to go, so Papa Bear is too hot. But when they go to a Reform synagogue, it's all in English. It's not what they're used to. Sometimes it's like, I'm waiting for the service to begin as we're singing all these great folk songs from the 70s and 80s. I don't want to go to a place where the rabbi doesn't wear kippah. I don't want to go to a place where the rabbi eats pork chops or the synagogue serves pork chops, right? And so rather than it being an intellectual thing, it's got a certain emotional or aesthetic to it that, Papa Bear's bed and synagogue is too medieval, and Baby Bear's synagogue is, it could be a universalist, it could be the Baha'i faith, it could be, it's not blue and white enough. So Mama Bear Shul is just right for me, right? Not because God deemed it so, but that really in a functional way, I think for a lot of conservative Jews. And then for a lot of Orthodox Jews in America, the issue is that Orthodoxy is right, even if I'm not that. So I don't pray 3 times a day. I don't keep so strictly kosher. I'm okay driving my car to the synagogue. Many Orthodox synagogues lock their parking lots on the Sabbath. So I park a couple blocks away because everybody knows I drive on the Sabbath, but I don't want to flaunt it, right? So I'm not and I don't go every week because, NFL playoffs are on Saturday and Sunday through the championship series. So I can't go to synagogue on that Saturday? Right, or college football season, depending on what time zone the Aztecs play in could determine when time my game is at. But the right way to be Jewish is Orthodox. I'm just somewhere between a C+ and an A- Jew, and so I figured that out. And a whole lot of Orthodox Jews in America really fit into that category, and they feel individually empowered to make those decisions, but that's not a change in Judaism. That's about how I interface or how I live that Judaism. 1973 first. There's a crazy story told in Germany about Regina Jonas, which I think is valid, that she was ordained as a rabbi as a child. Fascinating story, but that's its own historical anomaly. 1973, the Reform movement ordained Sally Present as the first modern, not even modern, the first female rabbi. She has a long career, fascinating rabbi. A dozen years later, Rabbi Amy Alberg, ordained to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Fascinating, more time to see how the conservative movement has to understand women differently than the tradition does to allow women to be rabbis, and Orthodoxy hasn't gotten there yet. So there's a left-leaning side of Orthodoxy today called Open Orthodoxy. Rabbi Avi Weiss in Riverdale in New York started a seminary probably over 20 years ago now. And then they started a sister college, kind of like the old days when the boys went to one school and the girls go to another school. Started a sister college, and brilliant female spiritual and educational leadership coming out of Avi Weiss's place for women, but they don't know what title to give them. They operate in an Orthodox world, so the things that they won't do things that women can't do. That woman who's so better educated than everybody else wouldn't come into an Orthodox synagogue and lead service if there were men present. There could be 999 women and one man, and the man would lead, and all kinds of things. But it's breaking down. So Sarah Hurwitz is the first alum of this place in Riverdale, and for a while she took the title of Maharat, which means our teacher and our leader, and it's a lovely acronym. And a number of years ago, she's like, yeah, forget that, call me Rabbah, which is sort of a feminization in Hebrew of the term rabbi. It's not exactly correct. That would be Rabbati, but and so it's fascinating. The Orthodox world's trying to figure it out, and it is bifurcating between those who refuse and those who want to make as many exceptions as possible. LGBTQ, quick history, and then I'm going to stop. 1977, the Reform movement, as a movement, vowed for the decriminalization of all things related to gay in America, but it still takes longer. 1990 is the first year. I think it's actually in 1990 that the college accepts an openly gay student. Right? There have been gay rabbis forever, but to accept an openly gay student with the intention of ordaining that student is a really big deal. It doesn't happen in the conservative movement until much later. hasn't happened in the Orthodox world yet. It's interesting, at one point all the movements had embraced secular same-sex marriage, because from a Jewish perspective the homophobic laws only apply to Jews. So it's kind of neat. The conservative movement follows, but is again like 10 years late, and even now, because of the way the conservative movement functions, it's got some oddities to it. It's a little bit simplistic to make the conservative movement look so good. I have my own criticisms that would still be relevant there. And I would say about orthodoxy, there are two kinds today. There are those who want to create every leniency possible and maintain the Orthodox system. If you don't maintain the Orthodox system, you can't be Orthodox anymore. Come and become a conservative rabbi. So there are two groups. One wants to make every concession possible. First, there are no restrictions on women as it relates to anything to do with sex or sexuality, other than women having sex with men. That's highly regulated. Women having sex with women is irrelevant in Judaism until the modern period. So any homophobic that are really anti-lesbian comments that come out from Jewishly can't be defended, at least not simply from the tradition. So there's an orthodoxy that says, look, there's no there. And then not just that, but even as it relates to gay men, it's a very, very narrow thing that would be the issue. And anything beyond that is homophobic, not Jewish law. Great example, it's relevant here to in San Diego County. People make a fuss because in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, male gay sex is called an abomination. But everybody who makes a fuss about that ignores the fact that eating non-kosher meat is called an abomination. So a number of important Orthodox rabbis have said, like, I can only go so far, because it still says that in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and to be who I am, I can only go so far, but I can only condemn it as harshly as I condemn eating a pork chop. Right? So I deserve to be called homophobic in the American thing. I wish it wasn't true. It's my tradition. There are ways in which I am sexist in the American context. I accept it. There are things that I just can't do. But my sexism doesn't mean a woman can't have a job, or a woman couldn't wear pants, or a woman couldn't do, right? There are specific things under medieval Jewish law that women can't do that an Orthodox rabbi would have to live by. But they can acknowledge them, and they don't have to do everything else. And same thing as it relates to homophobia, that they really are stuck. And so, at some point, if you're not willing to make that break, then there's some level at which you will be homophobic. And you need to accept that. I think you need to accept that in context, and you need to be careful that, if this is the boundary, that you don't do anything to cross it. You don't make abomination into a moral category that sounds worse than it is. If you want to, throw brimstone at people for eating pork chops, right? You got every right from a Jewish perspective. And then you can throw things, gay men too, because it's as bad as eating a pork chop. But very few Orthodox rabbis throw fire and brimstone on pork chop eaters, and nobody should be throwing them on people breaking the other abominations of the Bible. All right, I had hoped to save more time at the end. It's 9:59, but I did go late. So I don't know in terms of leaving the room, or in terms of where you guys have to go, or the Zoom room, or anything else, but I'm not in a rush. If people have any questions, I'm happy to take them. I want to be sensitive and respectful to St. Paul's. I have a great deal of respect for St. Paul's. I love coming. Whether I come and you guys do something, or I come and I do something, it's a ton of fun and good to be here. Yeah, Gary?
The matter of church-state separation is a big deal right now. With some serious assaults on it by members of the government and Christian. How, 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road, if that pursuit of theirs is more successful, what's the impact on Judaism?
That's great.
And for that matter, Islam?
So let's see if I really get to answer your question. Jews in the United States in the 20th century are amongst all religious groups, the most easy to peg as a political demographic. It's been as high as 80% in some presidential elections. Back in the 80s and Reagan, it was in the high 60s. Jews vote Democratic. The lowest in the 20th century, 21st century is 68%, which I think is Reagan's second term. And Jews embrace liberal causes, and that's across the spectrum when you start talking about immigration and other things. What's been really interesting, and I read that as hugely demoralizing and problematic, as has happened over the last decade in terms of the polarization of American culture, is more and more very liberal Jews are looking like very, very liberal Americans who are Jewish. And very traditional Jews are looking more and more like very conservative Americans who are Jewish. And I can do examples from both sides. The most recent one, you may be vaguely aware that abortion is a politically hot-button topic, as it has always been, but the Supreme Court has radically changed the playing field from where it had been set 50 years ago. And Judaism is really clear on abortion. It's not a hard one. And it's not one, there's a disagreement in the details, but, up until the last number of decades, nobody knows anything about bodily autonomy or a woman's rights. That's not the language of it. But strictly on abortion, Judaism requires an abortion in all cases where the quality of the mother's life is threatened. It's life does not begin at conception, unequivocally true in Judaism. And the question of when is an abortion necessary has been argued about in the Jewish tradition. And the more lenient, going so far as to include economic well-being, and this is medieval, I don't mean in the late 20th century, economic well-being, mental health, long before anybody had any kind of diagnosis from a psychiatrist, are categories that are relevant in determining whether or not a woman's required to have an abortion, which is incredible. The only exception to that I can find, again, there are some that are more restrictive in those categories, is very, very important 20th century Orthodox rabbi who on a couple of issues, never met him, was just terrible. And I don't know why. I think he was kind of prescient of hitching his wagon with American political conservatives. So he's the first one to almost get rid of abortions. But in the most recent abortion debate, if you were to look for Planned Parenthood or contribute across the entire Jewish spectrum of the United States, everybody is some flavor of pro-choice, easy, except for the Orthodox. That I see Orthodox rabbis making statements that they can't defend from Judaism. Like, you don't have to be as pinko commie leftist long hair tie-dye hippie as I am, right? I can defend my pinko commie leftist long hair tie-dye hippie stuff in the Jewish tradition, but you can be authentic to the tradition and be a lot more conservative than I am. But abortion happens to be clear. You can't argue that life begins at conception, and you can't argue that all abortions are forbidden from a Jewish perspective.
That second one, I got the health of the mother, but what was the second one, sir?
Financial health.
I got this.
Oh, the mental health.
I got that. That was number 5.
Oh.
When necessary, number 3. But number 2, I didn't get that clearly.
I don't know. If it's recorded, you can go back. I didn't think of it as a list, like 5 things.
Okay, so I just put when not necessary, when necessary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, but I find it disheartening that people who should know, but again, people can disagree with me, I got no issues, but people hold positions that are antithetical to the tradition. It's one thing when somebody more liberal than I am makes a claim and says something like, in Judaism today, styrofoam should be not kosher and not acceptable. Because I understand and they understand that they're creating a new category, taking old categories and doing it. But when somebody comes up today and says, it's okay for Jews to eat pork chops, then I have to say to them, why? And they say, because the Jewish legal system is no longer binding on Jews. I say, okay, you and I don't really disagree about pork chops. We agree, you're in a reform group that thinks that that's no longer relevant. I can get that. But when an Orthodox rabbi who says the tradition is still binding says that life begins at conception, I say, with all due respect, you're in the wrong church. I've got 20 centuries of literature trying to decide when life begins. And not once is there an opinion that has anything before the moment of birth. There's even an argument whether it's the head or the majority of the body, which is an important argument, because if a woman has a breech birth and is in labor and is struggling, if a breech birth counts as the baby, then you're stuck. Mom dying, baby dying, mom dying, baby dying. But if it's the head that determines the birth moment, then if you got a little butt and legs kicking out and the mother's life is at risk, you can kill it's still the fetus. right? So it's a huge difference in the medieval argument about whether or not it's the head or the tuchus on the feet that determine when the moment of birth happens and when that thing becomes a baby, and therefore its life is relevant, at least on some kind of relative scale to the mom. Fascinating stuff. All right, other questions? Yep. All right, Stacey?
Two comments from people on Zoom.
Oh yeah, there's a chat window. Thank you.
One, Vesta, said, I was a doctoral student at Jewish Theological Seminary when I was ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1984. So I was teased as being the first Jewish Theological Seminary woman to be ordained.
That's awesome.
Several of the faculty members attended my ordination, and the JTS food service helped me make the reception kosher.
That's beautiful. That is a great story. And there are some of these, again, our society has done major pivots in a very short window of time. And, and Vesta, I don't know if that's your name or otherwise, you live in that sacred moment as institutions in flux and change and are part of that historical reality. I come in for a whole variety of these things. I'm a baby, like at the tail end of it. That's a great story. Thank you.
And then Cindy said that she learned a lot this morning and she hopes you will come back often.
So I have this funny habit. I come every time I'm invited. Just a schedule question at that point. It's like people say to me, we really love to have dinner with you. And I think I lived in LA for a long time, and the standard way to say goodbye to somebody in LA was to say, we should do lunch sometime. Right? Should do lunch sometime. People say, we'd really like to have dinner with you. I say, if you'd like to have dinner with me, then invite me. Don't tell me you want to have dinner with me. Tell me you want to have dinner with me on Tuesday. I'm available or I'm not available. Be more than happy to come back. There are, thousands of things that are worthy of study together. And very interested in terms of thinking if there's study and conversations that we can have. I don't want to speak for any of the clergy or whatnot for St. Paul's, but to do it in conversation or in dialogue. It's also very interesting. You don't need me to tell you how wonderful the leadership of St. Paul's is. Anything else?
Yeah, I was wondering if you make any distinction between Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, or are ultra-Orthodox just more so?
Yeah, so it's an important distinction. The language is different if we were going to do Jewish movements in Israel. I said at near the beginning that 27%, a solid quarter of American Jews, and it's a growing percentage, identify as Jewish but don't relate to the movements, and the movements are all religiously based. They're all about synagogues and worshipy kinds of things. And for a solid 1 out of 4 American Jews, that's not the important rubric. And in Israel, it's even more different. There's a huge, synagogues function differently in the Israel context. The liberal movements are much smaller relative to the population, and a much greater percentage of the population live relatively religious Jewish lives without thinking of themselves as religious. That is, they go to synagogue and they don't eat pork chops, but they also do all kinds of other things. So in the American context, I would say there's still a distinction between Orthodox Jews who are engaged with American society and Orthodox Jews who have self-ghettoized and live in very, very closed off Jewish sections. There's a great story. I didn't mention Hasidic Judaism, which would fall broadly under Orthodox categories. I didn't mention Renewal Judaism, Zalman Schachter Shalomian, important. I didn't mention Reconstructionist Judaism. Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, is arguably amongst the most important American rabbis of the 20th century. I just saw his granddaughter, actually. Kind of fun. I can't imagine that she's lying. Having said that, the story is told, and I don't know if it's historical or apocryphal, but it ends in a place that's really valid, that the Second World War was outrageously destructive for the world and for the Jewish people. Roughly 50% of Jews were murdered. Not just died, millions of people died in the late 30s through the middle 40s. But 50% of world Jewry was intentionally murdered by the Nazi regime between 39 and 45, or 33 when they come to power, however you want to date the front end of it. That is, identify your group, and however you identify your group, you want to identify, your religion. Episcopals Episcopalians, you want to St. Paul's, you want to do your family of 4 or 5 or 6, you want to do your school or your workplace. I don't care what, you want to just take you and your spouse. You murder 50% of any group and you have radically changed that world. Just for the 50 who are dead, but for the 50% who survive. So 2 leaders of Hasidic dynasties from the old world come to the United States. Schneerson, from Lubov, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the Satmar Rebbe from a place in Eastern Europe called Satmar. And they know each other in the old world, and they come to America. They actually both make it before the war, but they look at the destruction in the 40s. And the Satmar Rebbe says the world is anti-Semitic. Hard to argue, you know. The world is anti-Semitic. Jewish people aren't going to survive. The best we can do is bury our head in the sand and just stay alive till God saves the world by sending the Messiah. So the Satmar Rebbe buys a piece of land outside of New York City, and and it's grown, and it's like an enclave. It's like its own independent commonwealth of Satmar Hasidim that exists in Muncie. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, contemporary of the Satmar Rebbe, coming from the same kind of Hasidic world, takes a look at the world and says, the world is anti-Semitic, the world murders the Jews, the world is devastated, horrific. What the world needs is joy and love in the Jewish people. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe recreates Judaism. He his own little Jewish Reformation or Reconstruction, though his followers would like it to be framed that way, and totally changes Hasidic Judaism in the United States, because now his disciples 3 generations later are in Balboa Park, and they'll say to you, "Oh, are you Jewish? Could I get you to do something Jewish?" Not because they're not a cult that they want you to come and be there all the time, but they believe if they can get a secular Jew to do one mitzvah, one good thing on one day, the world's a better place. And so the Satmars are waiting out in for God to redeem the world, and the Lubavitchers believe that if they can get some secular Jewish man, they live in a very sexist world, to put on the leather stuff, the tefillin on one time, that they're moving the world closer to that. It's a fascinating thing. 2 guys who share a lot in common, who have radically different reactions to it and have radically different influences. So there is an ultra-orthodoxy in the United States, and it's those, I think, who are no longer engaged in general in American society, except in the minimalist amount that they need to. Yep.
What is that all about? And is it legitimate?
What was the Messianic Judaism?
Messianic Judaism seems to be a movement that's catching on. I wondered how you feel.
I don't know if it's catching on or it's not catching on.
Well,
I don't have good demographic. I mean, that's not a question. I don't know. I don't have good demographic numbers that I feel good about. That's the academic in me. When people tell me things like orthodoxy is really, really growing, and the answer is it's not. That's a mistake. The percentage of Jews who identify as Jews, or synagogue goers who are quite young, is growing amongst the Orthodox, but there are other reasons to explain that than that Orthodox is growing. The overall percentage of Orthodox are not growing in the United States. But as it relates to Messianic Jews, first, language matters. I don't hear much about them now, but there used to be a movement from another Christian group called Jews for Jesus that recruited Jews deceitfully to accept Christ, with the idea that they could accept Christ and stay Jewish. And they did it deceitfully. So that's wrong, morally and across the board. But Messianic Jews are different. Messianic Judaism is a religion. From my world, it's a form of Christianity, but they wouldn't like that. It's not Judaism, right? We kind of figured out about 2,000 years ago that for a variety of reasons, one cannot accept the divinity of Jesus and remain Jewish. Or call it Judaism, right? That was figured out somewhere between the year 30 and the year 300. And I don't see any reason to go back on that. But they are honest and sincere people. It's easy to find a rabbi who will badmouth them and besmirch them the way I will Jews for Jesus. But I don't think that's fair. In fact, at the Starbucks that's right over here, I always get disoriented in your building, right? Starbucks is right over here. It's right down there. See, I told you, I always get disoriented in your building. There is a Messianic congregation in town called Adat Ariel. The spiritual leader is a fellow named Bernie Kasdan. I'll say it by name. Who's a good, honest guy. He grew up Jewish in San Diego. In fact, he had his bar mitzvah. Now I'm afraid to point. He had his bar mitzvah in my building at 3rd and Laurel. He and I were chaplains together on the police department. He is a good, honest person. He believes that a person can accept the divinity of Jesus and be a good Jew. He thinks he can be a rabbi and lead a synagogue that also worships the Son, the S-O-N, Son. And I think he's fundamentally wrong. The majority of the Jewish world agrees with me, and Messianic Jews aren't considered part of the larger Jewish community. And I've had really sad, painful conversations with Bernie, because it's Barney Kasdan, because he's an honest guy. There's nothing deceitful about him. I think he's wrong, but it's not deceitful. And, going back to the future in America question, and this was...
Do not the Jews say God can do anything?
So no, the Jews do not say that.
They do not say that.
Be very hard pressed to find a good...
Know that God can do anything.
Well, I don't know.
He takes care of the Jews, does he not?
I don't know.
He loves the Jews, does he not?
I don't know. I can show you lots of things where I'm not convinced that God loves the Jews.
He did not destroy
So
nor the Jews.
I want to get back to that question, but often when people say things to me that they believe with sincerity and authenticity, they're just not true in my world. So in the Bible, God can't do anything. In the Hebrew Bible, God is not omnipotent. The idea of omnipotence doesn't even exist until after the Hebrew Bible is finished being formed, or at least the majority of it. But I can show you where Jews believe the Messiah has come. I can show you in the Talmud where the Talmud says King Hezekiah was the Messiah. So be very careful when somebody makes comments about what Jews do and Jews don't do, because most of the time people are wrong when they say things like that.
That's right. Most people are wrong.
So when you say Jews don't believe that the Messiah has come yet, it's kind of true, but it's kind of wrong, because I can show you the Talmud says the Messiah has already come. Right? Came 700 years before Jesus. So again, that's what the Talmud says. As to what Jews believe, that's why I like Pew. Pew asks 1,000 Jews what they believe, so they can say 32% believe something. So the question about the law stuff in America, and it's kind of how I ended up being a police chaplain, is I don't want the U.S. government in any of its institutions taking a stand on whether Messianic Judaism qualifies as Judaism. It should qualify as a religion. In America, it should be given all the same rights and protections as the really, really big ones, or the kind of smallish ones like Judaism. I don't think it's part of Judaism. I'd be upset if the government somehow lumped it in with Judaism. But we're supposed to have, the First Amendment supposed to guarantee us free exercise and to be freed from any establishment. So, as is often the case, or always the case, that needs to be contextualized as to how it's understood. You coming for me? I got to stop. All right, lovely. A real treat to be here. May you only know good things. The cathedral.